My brother mocked my inheritance. I got the old house. He got Dad's business. Until the lawyer. My name is Leach. I'm 32 years old. And this is the story of how my family broke, and how I put the pieces back together, just not in the way anyone expected. It's a strange thing, learning the truth about the people you love only after they're gone. My brother's laughter echoed through the lawyer's office. It was a sharp, ugly sound in a room full of quiet grief. You got the old dump. Leach! I got the empire! He leaned back in his leather chair, smug and satisfied, while our aunt and uncle suddenly found the patterns on the carpet fascinating. No one would meet my eyes. My inheritance was a family joke, and I was the punchline. But what Blake didn't know was that the lawyer hadn't finished reading the will. He was still holding the last page, his gaze fixed on a single paragraph, and by the time he cleared his throat and read that paragraph aloud, my brother's smirk would vanish forever, because Dad's plan had only just begun. Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe, drop a comment where are you watching from. Growing up in Raleigh, North Carolina, our family was a carefully constructed image. We lived in a 2-story brick house with black shutters and a lawn so perfectly green it looked like a carpet. From the outside, we were the Allens. Solid, successful, American. Dad, Robert Allen, was the architect of this image. He was a decorated veteran who came home from the service with a spine of steel and a restless energy that he poured into building his company, Allen Steelworks. He started with a small fabrication shop and a loan he worked day and night to pay off. Over 30 years, he hammered and welded that small shop into a $3.8 million company, a local empire that supplied the bones for half the new buildings in the city. He was proud, demanding, and saw the world in terms of strength and weakness, success and failure. There was no middle ground with my father. My brother Blake was his perfect reflection. He was born with Dad's ambition burning in his veins, a fire that I seemed to lack. He was bold where I was reserved, loud where I was quiet. He didn't just enter a room, he conquered it. As a kid, he was the one hitting home runs while I was in the dugout, patiently fixing a loose board on the bench with a screwdriver I kept in my pocket. I remember one summer, Blake was the star of his Little League team. The championship game came down to the final inning. Blake was at bat, bases loaded. He hit a grand slam. The crowd went wild. Dad was in the stands, roaring with pride, and he lifted Blake onto his shoulders and carried him around the field like a hero. Later that day, at the celebratory barbecue in our backyard, Dad told the story of the grand slam to anyone who would listen. He never noticed that the picnic table everyone was eating on was no longer wobbly. I had spent the entire morning underneath it with a level, a drill, and a handful of wood shims, making it steady. No one ever noticed the quiet work, only the loud victories. This pattern defined our lives. In high school, Blake was the student body president, his charismatic speeches echoing through the auditorium. I was in the theater department, but not on stage. I was backstage, in the workshop, building the sets. I loved the smell of sawdust, the satisfying logic of a well-made joint, the quiet power of creating something real and solid with my own 2 hands. I remember one production of a streetcar named Desire, where the main staircase for the set was dangerously unstable. The drama teacher was in a panic. I stayed after school for 3 days, redesigning the supports, reinforcing the structure and making it rock solid. On opening night, when the lead actress made her dramatic descent, no one knew she was walking on my work. They only saw her. At the cast party, Blake, who had only attended because Dad made him, was surrounded by people, laughing and telling stories. He glanced over at me once, covered in a fine layer of sawdust, and said, "Still playing with your blocks, Leach?" It wasn't meant to be cruel, not really. It was just how he saw me. I was a hobbyist. He was an heir. Dad reinforced this view. Blake's first job at Allen Steelworks was a paid summer internship in the marketing department. He was given a new car to represent the company. My first job was an unpaid position in the archives, a dusty, forgotten basement room filled with 30 years of blueprints. Dad called it organizational practice. I spent that summer meticulously cataloging and preserving every drawing, learning the history of the company from the ground up. I saw how Dad's designs had evolved, how his early practical work gave way to more ambitious projects. I saw his mistakes and his triumphs, all laid out in faded blue ink. I learned more about the soul of Allen Steelworks in that basement than Blake ever did in his air-conditioned office. But when Dad asked us about our summers, Blake talked about a marketing campaign he'd designed. Dad beamed. I said I had finished cataloging the archives. Dad just nodded and said, "Good. A tidy space is a productive space." Everything became sharper, colder, after Mom died. I was 19 and Blake was 21. Her illness was a fast, brutal thief that stole the softness from our home, leaving only Dad's hard edges. Mom had been the buffer between us, the gentle hand that smoothed over Dad's rough demeanor. She was the one who would come into the garage and admire the birdhouse I was building, who would praise my attention to detail. "You have your father's hands, Leach," she'd say, "but you have your own heart." After she was gone, Dad didn't know how to grieve, so he worked. He buried his heart under balance sheets and production schedules, and the house became silent. Love in our home became a transaction. It had to be earned, measured in quantifiable results. Our Sunday dinners, which used to be filled with Mom's easy laughter, turned into formal progress reports. We would sit at the vast mahogany table she used to decorate with fresh flowers. Now it was just a barren, polished surface that felt more like a boardroom table. Dad would sit at the head, Blake on his right, and me on his left. "Blake closed the Henderson Tower deal today," Dad announced one evening, the pride in his voice as solid as the steel he sold. Blake had graduated and was now a vice president at the company. Biggest contract in the company's history. He went head-to-head with a national competitor and didn't blink. Blake would nod, trying to look humble but failing. "They thought we were just a local outfit. I showed them how we do business in Raleigh." "That's my boy," Dad would say, raising his glass of iced tea and a toast. "A true Allen." Then the inevitable turn. His eyes would land on me. The question was always the same, a slight variation on a theme of polite disinterest. "And you, Leach?" he'd ask. I was in my final year of an architecture and structural engineering program. Still in the library? "I finished my senior project," I'd say, my voice feeling small in the cavernous dining room. I designed and built a load-bearing arch bridge model. The professor said it was one of the strongest designs he's ever seen. Dad would take a slow sip of his tea. "That's nice. Make sure your grades are up. A good GPA is important." He didn't ask to see the design. He didn't ask about the load it could bear. It was just another hobby, another set of blocks. I learned to swallow the disappointment. I learned to stop expecting praise and to find satisfaction in the work itself. I built furniture for my small apartment, fixed my friends' broken appliances, and graduated at the top of my class. I was practical. I was reliable. I was competent. But in the grand dramatic story of the Allen family, I was just a footnote. Blake was the headline, and for 32 years, that was a truth as solid and unmovable as the steel my father sold. Dad's heart attack was brutally efficient. There was no warning, no long illness, no chance for a final goodbye. One minute he was at his desk, a titan of industry yelling at a supplier on the phone. The next he was gone. He was 65 years old, a man built of iron who was taken down by his own faulty wiring. The call didn't come from Blake. It came from my Aunt Carol, her voice a trembling mess on the other end of the line. "Leach, honey, it's your father. There's been an attack. Blake is on his way to the hospital." He hadn't thought to call his sister. I broke every speed limit getting there, my mind a frantic, blank slate. When I arrived, the waiting room was cold and smelled of antiseptic. Blake was there, not crumpled in a chair like the other grieving families, but standing by the window, his back to the room, talking on his cell phone. His voice was low but firm. "No, the meeting will have to be pushed to Thursday. And get Donnelly on the phone. We need to activate the succession plan immediately." He was managing the situation. He was already stepping into the role of CEO. When he finally saw me, he ended the call and gave me a brief, awkward hug. "He's gone, Leach," he said, his voice devoid of any real emotion. It was a statement of fact, a transfer of information. The days that followed were a surreal nightmare. Blake took charge of the funeral arrangements, and every decision was a reflection of his own ambition. I wanted a small, private service. I wanted to remember our father, the man who smelled of sawdust and taught me how to change a tire. Blake wanted a grand public spectacle to honor Robert Allen, the founder of Allen Steelworks. He won, of course. He booked St. Mary's Chapel, the largest in the city. He selected the most expensive mahogany casket. He curated the guest list as if he were planning a gala, ensuring every important business leader and city official was invited. I tried to argue for a simple spray of daisies, Mom's favorite flower, to be placed on the casket. Blake ordered enormous ostentatious wreaths of white lilies, calling them more appropriate for a man of his stature. I felt like I was being systematically erased from my own. Father's death, the funeral itself felt less like a memorial, and more like a corporate networking event. The pews were filled with men in dark, expensive suits from the Chamber of Commerce, city council members, and business partners. They spoke in hushed, respectful tones about Dad's business acumen, his ruthless negotiation tactics, and his contributions to the local economy. They talked about the empire he built, Very few of them talked about the man. I saw a few of the older factory foremen standing awkwardly in the back, their work-worn hands clasped in front of them. They looked genuinely sad, and I felt a stronger connection to them than to anyone in the front pews. Blake stood at the door, the perfect grieving son. He greeted every guest with a firm handshake and a somber, practiced nod. He wore a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. He looked every bit the heir apparent, stepping into his father's shoes before the man was even in the ground. He was performing grief, and he was doing it flawlessly. When it was his turn to deliver the eulogy, he walked to the pulpit with a confident, measured stride. He unfolded a piece of paper but barely looked at it. His speech had been rehearsed. My father, Robert Allen, was more than just a parent, he began, his voice resonating with practiced emotion through the chapel's sound system. He was my mentor, my hero, my best friend. He taught me that success is not given. It is earned through grit, determination, and an unwavering vision. He built an empire with his own 2 hands, and from the time I was a boy, he taught me how to lead from the front. He went on for 10 minutes, weaving a masterful story of a father-son partnership, a sacred legacy passed from one great man to the next. He talked about business deals they had closed together, challenges they had overcome. He painted a picture of himself as Dad's right-hand man, his co-pilot, the one person his father trusted to carry the torch forward. He told an anecdote about a tough negotiation where Dad had let him take the lead and how proud he had been. It was a performance designed to solidify his position, to assure the business community that the empire was in steady hands. Not once did he mention Mom, the woman who had supported Dad through the lean early years. And not once did he mention me, his sister, who had sat at the same dinner table her entire life. Listening to him speak, I felt a profound and hollow sense of invisibility. It was as if I hadn't existed. I was just a piece of scenery in the grand drama of Robert and Blake Allen. I sat alone in the front pew, a ghost at my own father's funeral. My hand was shoved deep in my coat pocket, clutching a worn, folded letter. I had found it 2 nights before, while looking for Dad's life insurance policy in his home office. In the back of his main desk drawer, beneath a stack of old checkbooks, was a plain white envelope with my name, Leach, written on the front in his familiar, sharp handwriting. It was dated just 2 months before his death. My heart had pounded as I opened it, hoping for a final word, an explanation, an apology. But the letter inside was short, cryptic, and felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. All it said was, "You'll understand soon." That was it. 3 words. No explanation, no context. It was never mailed, just left there for me to find. As Blake's triumphant voice filled the chapel, turning our family's grief into his personal coronation, I held on to that piece of paper like a lifeline. It was the only proof I had that my father had been thinking of me at all in his final months. It was a promise or a warning, and I had no idea which. It was the only thing that felt real in a day filled with performance and lies. 3 days after the funeral, the 5 of us, me, Blake, our Aunt Carol, and Uncle Gene, were ushered into the law offices of Henderson and Fox. The air outside was thick with the cloying sweetness of Raleigh in late spring, but inside the office the atmosphere was cold and still. The room was a cliché of old money and legal gravitas, dark mahogany paneling, shelves of leather-bound books that looked as if they'd never been opened, and a massive desk that served as a fortress for Mr. Donnelly, Dad's lawyer for over 30 years. He was a kind, aging man with watery blue eyes and a soft voice that seemed ill-suited for delivering life-altering news. He looked at me with a flicker of genuine sympathy when I walked in, a small kindness that felt like a glass of water in a desert. Blake, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with impatience. He sat beside me, though a canyon of silence stretched between us. He checked his watch twice in the first 5 minutes. For him, this was the final formality, the legal rubber stamp on a reality he had claimed his entire life. On the drive over, he had been talking nonstop about his plans. First thing is a complete rebrand, he'd said, not to me but to the windshield. Modernize the logo, expand into the international market. Dad was too old school, too cautious. He hadn't asked me a single question about how I was feeling. Mr. Donnelly cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He put on his reading glasses with slow, deliberate movements and picked up the thick, cream-colored document that was Dad's last will and testament. I, Robert Allen, being of sound mind and body, he began, his voice a low monotone. He went through the usual legal declarations, each word making my father's death feel colder, more transactional. My stomach was a tight, nervous knot. I expected nothing. Expecting nothing was my default setting in the Allen family. It was the only way to avoid disappointment. Mr. Donnelly went through the minor bequests first, building a quiet tension in the room. A generous donation to the Veterans Association, a small but significant sum to his longtime secretary, a few antique pieces of furniture to Aunt Carol and Uncle Gene. Blake tapped his pen on the arm of his chair, a rhythmic, irritating sound that broadcasted his boredom. He wanted the lawyer to get to the main event. Finally, Mr. Donnelly got to the primary bequests. He paused, took a sip of water, and looked over his glasses at my brother. "First," he said, his voice now holding a different weight, "to my son, Blake Allen, I leave my entire 51% controlling interest in the company I founded, Allen Steelworks, including all company assets, properties, and accounts associated with the business." A slow, triumphant grin spread across Blake's face. He didn't even try to hide it. He leaned back in his chair, the very picture of a king claiming his throne. He had it all. The empire, the legacy, the universe had simply confirmed what he and everyone else had always known to be true. He cast a quick, pitying glance in my direction. It was a look that said, "Game over." I won. Then Mr. Donnelly turned his gaze to me. I braced myself. "To my daughter, Leach Allen," he read, and I held my breath. "I leave the family property located at 14 Cedar Lane, and all contents therein." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. 14 Cedar Lane, the old house, the one Dad had grown up in on the other side of town. It had been empty for 20 years, a place we drove past but never visited. It was a neighborhood landmark for all the wrong reasons. The paint was peeling in long, leprous strips. The porch was visibly sagging, and the yard was a jungle of weeds and creeping vines that threatened to swallow the house whole. It was worthless, a liability, a teardown. Blake didn't just chuckle. He laughed. A full, unrestrained, barking laugh that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. It was a sound of pure, cruel victory. "You got the rotting shack, sis," he said, shaking his head with a wide, mocking smirk. Aunt Carol shot him a sharp look, but he ignored her. "I guess Dad gave you something to fix after all. Keeps you busy with your little projects." The heat of humiliation washed over my face, so intense it felt like a fever. I stared down at my hands, my knuckles white, my fingernails digging into my palms. He was right. That's exactly what it felt like. Dad had given me a project, a broken-down symbol of my place in his life. I was the fixer, the quiet one who dealt with the forgotten, broken things. Even in death, he had reinforced our roles. Blake got the future. I got the derelict past. But then something strange happened. Something that didn't fit the narrative. Mr. Donnelly didn't close the heavy folder. He didn't put the will away. He just sat there, staring at the final page, a deeply troubled expression on his face. He adjusted his glasses. He cleared his throat again. His finger traced a single line of text, as if he were reading it over and over, trying to convince himself it was real. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Blake's laughter had died down, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Is that everything, Donnelly?" he asked, already starting to rise from his chair. "I've got a company to run." Mr. Donnelly didn't look at him. He looked at me. Finally, he looked up and his watery eyes met mine. There was something in them I couldn't decipher. It looked like a warning. "There is," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "One more clause." Blake's triumphant grin vanished completely. He slowly sank back into his chair. The joke was over. The atmosphere in the room, which had been relaxed and final just a moment before, instantly became charged with a thick, anxious tension. Blake leaned forward, his smug confidence replaced by a sharp, suspicious glare. His whole body was coiled like a spring. "What clause?" he demanded, his voice edged with an irritation that bordered on a threat. "The company is mine." "You just said so?" Mr. Donnelly held up a calming hand, but his eyes remained fixed on the document in front of him. He seemed to be choosing his next words with extreme care. "Your father was a very precise man, Blake. He structured his will in a very particular way." He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was louder, more formal. He was no longer just reading. He was declaring, "As of the date this will is executed," he began, "primary control of Allen Steelworks, as bequeathed to Blake Allen, is conditional." The word hung in the air. "Conditional." Blake let out a short, incredulous scoff. "Conditional? What does that mean?" "That's just legal boilerplate, right? A technicality?" He was looking for reassurance, for a quick dismissal so he could reclaim his victory. Mr. Donnelly didn't offer any. "It is not a technicality, Blake. It is the central provision of this entire section." He continued to read, his voice giving each word a heavy, deliberate weight. "The company, its assets, and its operational leadership may not be sold, leveraged, mortgaged, or fundamentally restructured for a period of 18 months following my death. Blake's face, which had been pale, began to turn a mottled red. What? That's insane. That's completely unworkable. I can't run a business with my hands tied behind my back. What if a major opportunity comes up? I need to be agile. Your father was very clear, Mr. Donnelly said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The core structure of the company he built must remain untouched for the probationary period. He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the next blow. There's more. During this 18-month period, the company's board of directors must submit comprehensive quarterly financial reports, including profit and loss statements, debt-to-asset ratios, and a summary of all major contracts, to the court-appointed executor of my estate. The room was dead silent. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting down the seconds of my brother's collapsing world. An executor? I didn't understand. I assumed Blake, as the new owner, would be his own executor, handling everything. Who's the executor? Blake snapped, his voice tight and strained. He looked at the lawyer. You, Donnelly. Is this some power play you cooked up with the old man? Mr. Donnelly slowly shook his head, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He took off his glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them on the desk. He was no longer looking at the will. He was looking directly at me, and his expression was a complex mixture of apology and solemn duty. Per your father's legally binding and notarized request, he said, his voice now impossibly firm and clear, the sole executor of his estate is Ms. Leach Allen. The words landed in the center of the room like a physical weight. For a second, no one moved. No one breathed. Blake just stared, his mouth slightly open, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending disbelief. I felt my own heart thudding against my ribs, a wild, panicked drumbeat. Me, the executor? I didn't know the first thing about corporate finance or profit and loss statements. It made no sense. It was a mistake. The executor? Blake finally choked out, the words a strangled whisper. He swiveled his head to face me, his eyes wide with a torrent of confusion and rage. You? What the hell is that supposed to mean? It means, Mr. Donnelly said, his voice cutting through Blake's rising panic, that your sister holds complete and total oversight authority over all company operations for the next 18 months. While you will manage the day-to-day business, she, as executor, must review and approve every quarterly report. If she finds evidence of mismanagement or deems the reports to be unsatisfactory, she has the legal authority to petition the court. She is, in effect, the temporary custodian of your father's legacy. A custodian, a protector, not a punchline. Suddenly, my mind flashed back to the cryptic note tucked away in my pocket. You'll understand soon. And in that instant, I did. A wave of stunning ice-cold clarity washed over me, so powerful it almost took my breath away. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an insult. This was a chess move, a meticulously planned posthumous maneuver from a man who knew his children perfectly. He knew Blake's arrogance, his recklessness, his hunger for glory at any cost. And he knew me. He knew I was the quiet one, the one who fixed things, the one who read the instructions and checked the foundations before building. He had seen it all. He hadn't given Blake the company as a gift. He'd given it to him as a final high-stakes exam. He hadn't given me a rotting house as a cruel joke. He had given me a watchtower. I slowly turned my head and looked at my brother. The smug, triumphant king was gone. In his place was a pale, cornered man, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. The empire he had been handed just minutes ago now came with a leash, a very short leash, and I was the one holding it. My father hadn't made a mistake. He'd made a test, and he had just made me the proctor. The meeting ended in a blur. Blake stormed out without a word. As I was leaving, stunned and overwhelmed, Mr. Donnelly gently touched my arm. Your father had immense faith in you, Leach, he said quietly. He told me himself. He said, Blake knows how to make a splash, but Leach knows how to stop a leak. Walking out of that cold office and into the warm sunlight, the world felt different. I wasn't Leach, the quiet sister. I wasn't the footnote. I was the executor, and my father's final plan had just begun. That evening, after the cold, sterile environment of the lawyer's office, I felt an inexplicable pull to Cedar Lane. I drove through parts of Raleigh I hadn't seen in years, where the new sprawling suburbs gave way to older, smaller neighborhoods with big oak trees and houses that had histories. The GPS said I had arrived, and I parked my car across the street from number 14. Blake was right. It was a dump. The white paint was more of a flaky gray, peeling away from the wood siding like sunburnt skin. The porch sagged on one end, held up by a prayer and a single tilted column. The windows were grimy, and the yard was a wild tangle of overgrown bushes and knee-high grass. It looked forgotten, abandoned, but as I stepped out of my car, I didn't feel pity for the place. I felt a strange sense of homecoming. This was where my father had grown up. This was the house his hands had helped maintain as a boy. There was more of him here than in the polished, empty mansion he'd left behind. I walked up the cracked concrete path, the iron gate groaning in protest as I pushed it open. The key Mr. Donnelly had given me was old and brass. It felt heavy in my palm. It slid into the lock with a rusty scrape, and with a bit of a struggle, the heavy oak door creaked open. The air inside was thick and musty, filled with the scent of old wood, dust, and time. A fine layer of gray dust covered everything, but the furniture was still there, draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. I could see the outlines of a sofa, armchairs, a coffee table. Sunlight streamed through a dirty window, illuminating swirling dust motes in the air. I walked through the small living room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, and into the kitchen. The appliances were ancient, a pale yellow refrigerator humming faintly in the corner. For some reason, I opened it. It was empty, of course, but it was clean. Someone had wiped it down before they left for the last time. My exploration eventually led me out the back door and to the detached garage. The side door was unlocked. I pulled it open, and it was like stepping into a sanctuary. It was my father's old workshop. A long, sturdy tool bench ran along the back wall, and every tool was in its place. Hammers, wrenches, and screwdrivers hung neatly on a pegboard, their silhouettes traced in black marker so you'd know exactly where each one belonged. Jars of screws, nails, and bolts were lined up on shelves, each one labeled in his sharp, blocky handwriting. This was the man I knew, not the CEO, not the titan of industry, but the man who taught me how to use a wood plane, how to measure twice and cut once. The man who smelled of sawdust and machine oil. A wave of grief so sharp and pure it buckled my knees hit me right then. This place wasn't a punishment. It was a connection. As I steadied myself against the workbench, my eyes landed on something tucked behind a stack of old paint cans. It was a simple manila envelope, thick with its contents. My name, Leach, was written on the front. My hand trembled as I reached for it. It was the same handwriting as the letter I'd found in his desk. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. This was the understanding he had promised. I sat down on an old wooden stool, the dust puffing up around me, and carefully opened the flap. Inside were two things: a small silver key and a black USB drive. There was also a single folded sheet of paper. I opened it first. The note was brief, for when Blake starts losing control, it wasn't a question of if. It was a statement of when. My father had known. He had seen the recklessness in his son, the ego that would eventually consume his judgment. He had anticipated the failure. I plugged the USB drive into my phone using an adapter I kept in my purse. The drive was labeled Insurance. It contained a dozen folders, meticulously organized by year. I clicked on the most recent one. It was all there. Years of financial records, company statements, private bank accounts. But there was more. Dad had saved copies of internal emails, detailed notes from meetings, even audio recordings of phone calls he'd made. I scrolled through, my breath catching in my throat. I found a folder labeled BA Loans. Inside were loan agreements from high-interest private lenders, taken out by Blake using company assets as collateral, all without my father's signature or approval. He was siphoning money, hiding debt off the official books to fund risky side ventures that had all failed. Millions of dollars. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. Dad had known. He must have discovered it months ago. I found a note he had written to himself, dated 3 months before his death. Blake is gambling with our legacy. He sees the company as his personal piggy bank. Confronting him will only make him hide it better. There has to be another way, a way to protect the work, to protect the employees. This was the other way. He couldn't bring himself to fire his own son, to expose him and ruin him publicly. The family image was too important. So he created a failsafe. He built this elaborate test, this 18-month trial, and put me at the center of it. He wasn't just giving Blake a chance to prove himself. He was giving him a chance to fail spectacularly, on his own terms. And he had armed me with the evidence to protect the company when it happened. The small silver key was for a safe deposit box at a downtown bank. I went the next day. Inside was more of the same. Hard copies of the loan documents, notarized statements from an accountant Dad had secretly hired to track Blake's activities, and a personal letter addressed to me. Leach, it began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have started to uncover the mess. I am sorry to put this weight on you. I was a fool. I let my pride in my son blind me to his flaws. I celebrated his ambition and ignored his lack of character. I pushed you aside because your quiet strength didn't make for a good story at the country club. I was wrong. Blake knows how to make deals, but you know how to build things that last. That house on Cedar Lane, the one I'm leaving you, is where I learned the value of a solid foundation. I hope you'll learn it there too. Don't let him destroy what I built. You are stronger than you think. You are stronger than him. Tears streamed down my face as I read the words. It was the validation I had spent my entire life craving, delivered only after he was gone. He saw me. He finally truly saw me. I sat in that cold, sterile bank vault and cried for the father I had lost, and for the father I had just found. The old house wasn't a rotting shack. It was an arsenal. It was the foundation of Dad's real legacy, and he had just handed me the blueprints. The first quarterly review was held 90 days after the will reading. I spent those 3 months living a strange double life. By day, I was at the house on Cedar Lane, slowly bringing it back to life. I tore out the old, stained carpets, revealing beautiful hardwood floors underneath. I patched the plaster, scraped away the peeling paint, and spent hours in the workshop, using Dad's tools to repair a wobbly banister or build a new window frame. The work was hard and satisfying. It cleared my head and grounded me. By night, I was poring over the files on the USB drive, cross-referencing them with the preliminary reports the company was legally required to send me. I was studying my father's business, learning its rhythms, its strengths, and the vulnerabilities Blake was creating. The day of the meeting, I dressed simply, in dark pants and a plain blouse. I walked into the Allen Steelworks boardroom feeling like an imposter. It was the same room where Dad had made his biggest deals, his presence still palpable in the heavy wood and leather. The board members, all men who had known me since I was a child, looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. Blake sat at the head of the table, in Dad's chair, radiating an aura of forced confidence. He'd put on weight, and his face was puffy. "Leach," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Glad you could make it. We can make this quick. Things are great. Profits are up. Let's sign the papers so we can all get back to work." He slid a ridiculously thin folder across the table toward me. It was a joke. A 3-page summary with vague projections and inflated numbers. It was an insult to my intelligence and to the board's. I didn't open it. Instead, I pulled a neatly organized binder from my own bag and placed it on the table with a soft thud. "Thank you, Blake," I said, my voice even and calm. "But I have a few questions about the quarterly report I was sent last week." The mood in the room tensed. I opened my binder to the first tab. "Page 3 of the profit and loss statement," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It lists a significant new contract with a company called Apex Innovations. Can you tell us more about them?" "My research shows they were incorporated just 6 months ago and have no credit history." Blake's face tightened. "It's a tech startup. High risk, high reward. Dad was always telling me to innovate. Dad also said to never extend a line of credit to a company that couldn't survive a bad winter," I countered, quoting one of his favorite sayings. "You fronted them $500,000 in materials, with no payment for 120 days. That's not an investment. It's a gamble with the company's cash flow." One of the older board members, a man named George who had been Dad's first employee, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could see he agreed. I continued page by page, calmly dissecting their report. I asked about the firing of 2 senior staff members, both loyal and experienced men who had been with Dad for decades. Blake claimed they were resistant to change. I asked about the sudden switch in suppliers for raw materials, moving from a reliable local company to a cheaper, overseas firm with a questionable reputation for quality. He called it optimizing the supply chain. By the end of the meeting, Blake's face was a mottled red. He wasn't in control, and everyone knew it. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a single accusation. I had simply asked the questions my father would have asked, armed with the knowledge he had left me. I refused to sign off on the report, stating it was incomplete and lacked the necessary documentation. I gave them a list of the documents I required and scheduled a follow-up meeting in 2 weeks. As I walked out, I heard George, the old board member, say quietly to another, "She's her father's daughter, all right." It was the first time in my life anyone had ever said that about me. The next 3 months were a slow-motion train wreck. Blake, furious at being challenged, doubled down on his reckless behavior. He started avoiding my calls and responding to my official requests with curt, dismissive emails. He saw my oversight not as a safeguard, but as a personal attack. The second quarterly report was even worse than the first. Profits were down, way down. The Apex Innovations deal had collapsed. the startup vanishing overnight and leaving Allen Steelworks holding the bag for the unpaid materials. Quality control complaints from long-term clients were starting to pour in due to the new, inferior steel. I sent the first certified letter. It was a formal warning, drafted by Mr. Donnelly, stating that the company was in breach of the conditions set forth in the will due to financial mismanagement. It was a quiet legal shot across the bow. He didn't respond with a letter. He responded by showing up at the house on Cedar Lane one night. I was on the porch, painting the new railing I'd built, when his expensive car screeched to a halt at the curb. He stormed up the path, his face a mask of fury. "What the hell is this?" he yelled, waving the letter in his hand. "Are you trying to ruin me? Are you trying to destroy Dad's company?" I calmly put my paintbrush down and faced him. The porch light cast long shadows, making the moment feel theatrical and grim. "I'm trying to protect it," I said, my voice low. "The same way Dad wanted me to. Dad wanted me to run his company," he roared. "He left it to me, not you. You were supposed to stay out of the way in your little workshop." The words stung, but I didn't flinch. "He left you the title, Blake. He left me the responsibility." "There's a difference. You're sabotaging me," he accused, his voice cracking with a strange mix of rage and desperation. "You're enjoying this. You've always been jealous of me, and now you're getting your revenge." I looked at my brother, truly looked at him. I didn't see a powerful CEO. I saw a scared, insecure man who had been given everything and had learned the value of nothing. I didn't feel anger. I felt a deep, profound sadness. "No, Blake," I said, my voice softer now. "I'm not sabotaging you. I'm just watching. And you're proving Dad right." That was what finally broke him, the truth of it. He stared at me, speechless, his chest heaving. The fight went out of him, replaced by a look of bleak understanding. He knew I was right. He knew he was failing. He turned without another word, walked back to his car, and drove away into the night. I stood on the porch for a long time, the smell of fresh paint in the air. The power hadn't just shifted. The foundation of our family, built on a lie, was beginning to crumble. The next 3 months were a period of grim silence. Blake stopped communicating almost entirely, sending only the bare minimum of financial data required by the court. But the numbers told a story he couldn't hide. It was a story of accelerating decline. He was taking out more high-interest loans, not for investment, but just to make payroll. He lost the city contract, our biggest and most stable client for over 20 years, because of a missed deadline and a shipment of substandard steel beams. The company my father had spent his life building was bleeding out, and my brother was holding the knife. I continued my work at the house. It was my anchor in the storm. The exterior was now a respectable shade of slate blue with crisp white trim. I had planted a garden in the front yard, and the first green shoots were beginning to push their way through the dark soil. The house was becoming a home, my home. Inside, I had set up a small office in the spare bedroom where I tracked every move Blake made. I documented every bad deal, every new loan, every client complaint. I was building a case, not out of malice, but out of a solemn duty to my father. 9 months and 2 weeks after the will reading, the phone call I had been dreading and expecting finally came. It was Mr. Donnelly. "Leach, it's time," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The auditors have finalized the numbers from the 3rd quarter. It's definitive." My heart sank, a heavy stone in my chest. I knew what this meant. It was the trigger. I closed my eyes and pictured the clause in Dad's will, the one I now knew by heart. It stated that if the company's net profits dropped below a 25% threshold for 2 consecutive quarters, as verified by an independent auditor, Blake's conditional ownership would be immediately revoked. The company would revert to the estate, to be managed by the executor, by me. "What are the numbers?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "A 32% loss in the 2nd quarter," he replied, "and a 41% loss in the 3rd. He's been mortgaging company property to cover operational costs. It's far worse than we thought. There's a mandatory board meeting scheduled for Friday morning. You need to be there." The days leading up to that meeting were the longest of my life. I felt the full weight of my father's plan on my shoulders. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. It was the complete and utter failure of my brother, a failure our father had foreseen and prepared for. The night before the meeting, I sat in my new office, the USB drive in my hand. I thought about not going. I thought about just letting it all collapse, walking away from the mess. But then I looked at the letter from the safe deposit box, which I kept on my desk. You were always the one who could rebuild. It wasn't a choice. It was a calling. Friday morning, I walked into the boardroom at Allen Steelworks for the last time as an overseer. The atmosphere was funereal. The auditors were there, 2 serious-looking men in gray suits. The board members were all present, their faces grim. Blake sat at the head of the table, but he looked like a ghost. He was pale, his eyes were sunken, and the expensive suit he wore seemed to hang off his frame. He didn't look at me when I entered. I took my seat, placing my binder quietly on the table in front of me. I was no longer an imposter. I was the most prepared person in the room. The lead auditor stood up and delivered his report in a flat, dispassionate voice. He detailed the catastrophic losses, the spiraling debt, the broken contracts, and the dangerously low cash reserves. He presented charts and graphs that showed a company in a nosedive. With every word, Blake seemed to shrink further into his chair. When the auditor finished, Blake finally spoke, his voice thin and reedy. "It's the market, a downturn. These things are cyclical." He started to ramble, making excuses, blaming everyone but himself. He accused the suppliers of price gouging, the clients of being unreasonable, the economy of being unstable. Then he turned his attention to me, his eyes burning with a desperate, hateful light. "And her," he said, pointing a shaking finger across the table. "She's been undermining me from day one, poisoning the board, interfering. This is her fault." No one said a word. His accusations fell flat in the face of the undeniable facts. The numbers didn't lie. The documents didn't lie. He had done this to himself. When he finally ran out of steam, a heavy silence descended on the room. Mr. Donnelly, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, stood up. He held a legal document in his hand. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said. "The findings are clear. As per the last will and testament of Robert Allen, the trigger clause regarding the conditional ownership of Allen Steelworks has been activated." He walked over and stood behind Dad's empty chair, the one I was about to occupy. "Effective immediately," he read aloud, his voice echoing in the silent room. "All shares, assets, and operational control of Allen Steelworks are hereby reverted to the estate of Robert Allen. Full and sole authority is transferred to the estate's executor." He paused and looked right at me. "Ms. Leach Allen." I looked at my brother. All the color had drained from his face. He was shaking, his hands trembling on the polished surface of the table. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. In that moment, he wasn't my rival or my tormentor. He was just my brother, lost and broken. The empire he had craved, the approval he had lived for, had all just turned to dust in his hands. There was no triumph in me, only a deep, aching sorrow for what we had lost, and a terrifying resolve for what I now had to do. The week that followed was a blur of frantic activity. The moment the board meeting ended, I was no longer an observer. I was in command. While Blake packed his personal effects from the CEO's office in a stunned, silent haze, I was in the conference room with Mr. Donnelly and the company's accountants, triaging the damage. The situation was dire. The company was drowning in short-term debt and had barely enough cash to make the next payroll. Morale among the remaining employees was at an all-time low. They were expecting a bankruptcy announcement any day. My first official act was to call an all-hands meeting. I stood before the 50 or so employees gathered on the factory floor, men and women who had known me my whole life as the quiet boss's daughter. Their faces were etched with anxiety and distrust. They expected me to be a placeholder, a liquidator. "Good morning," I began, my voice amplified by a small microphone. It didn't tremble. "My name is Leach Allen. As many of you know, I am now in charge of this company. I know there are a lot of rumors and a lot of fear. So let me be clear. We are not closing down. We are not selling. And no one else is losing their job." A murmur went through the crowd. I could see flickers of surprise, of cautious hope. "My father did not build this company to be gambled away," I continued, my gaze sweeping across their faces. "He built it to last. He built it on the quality of your work and the strength of our reputation. We've lost our way. My job is to find our way back. It won't be easy and it won't be fast. But starting today, we are going to stop the bleeding and start rebuilding, beam by beam. Now let's get back to work." It wasn't a rousing speech, but it was honest. It was direct, and it was exactly what they needed to hear. That afternoon, I made my first big decision. I picked up the phone and called George, the senior manager Blake had fired, the man who had worked alongside my father for 40 years. I asked him to come back, not just as a manager, but as my chief operating officer. He was hesitant at first, but when I walked him through my plan, a detailed, practical strategy focused on stabilizing finances, restoring client relationships, and prioritizing quality over reckless growth, he agreed. His return sent a powerful message through the company. The old values were back. Together, we spent the next few months in the trenches. I used my inheritance from my mother's side, money I had carefully saved and invested over the years, to inject enough capital to keep the company afloat. We met with the banks and renegotiated the crippling loans Blake had taken on. I personally called every client we had lost, apologized for the drop in quality, and promised to earn back their trust. Some hung up on me, but many who had respected my father agreed to give us a second chance. We started small. With modest contracts we knew we could deliver flawlessly. One rainy afternoon, I was finally clearing out the last of Blake's things from the CEO's office. He had left it in a state of chaos. I was sorting through the papers on the massive desk, my father's desk, when my hand brushed against a small hidden button on the underside. I pressed it. A small secret drawer, one I never knew existed, clicked open. Inside, there was only one thing. Another letter in a plain white envelope, with Leach written on the front. My heart leaped into my throat. It felt like a final message from beyond the grave. With trembling hands, I opened it. Leach, it read. If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. It means Blake has fallen, and you are now sitting in my chair. I know you feel the weight of this. I know you may even feel guilty. Do not. I gave your brother every advantage, every opportunity. The choice to fail was his alone. Your task now is to rebuild. It is what you have always done best. You see the cracks in a foundation that others ignore. You have the patience to fix things correctly, not just quickly. But I have one last piece of advice for you. If Blake falls, help him up, but never, ever at your own expense. Your strength is not a resource for him to drain. You are not his safety net. You are his sister. He must learn to stand on his own. I was not the father you deserved. I was too caught up in the noise of ambition to appreciate the quiet music of your competence. I am proud of you, Leach. I was always proud of you. Even when I was too stubborn and too blind to say it. You were always the one who could rebuild. I sank into the large leather chair, the letter clutched in my hand, and finally let myself cry. I cried for the years of being misunderstood, for the pain of feeling invisible. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. He had known. He had understood everything. This whole elaborate, painful ordeal wasn't just a test for Blake. It was a gift to me. It was his way of finally giving me the key to the kingdom. Not because I was his daughter, but because I had earned it. When the tears subsided, I looked around the office. It still smelled faintly of my father's cigar smoke. I touched the worn leather of his chair. This wasn't just his office anymore. It was mine. The following week, I officially filed the paperwork. Allen Steelworks was no more. The company was reborn as Allen Heritage Works. It wasn't just about steel anymore. It was about legacy. 2 years have passed since I took over the company. The house on Cedar Lane gleams with new paint and a garden that blooms vibrantly from spring through fall. The sagging porch is now straight and strong, with a comfortable swing where I drink my coffee in the mornings. It's both my home and my headquarters, the place where I honor my father's true legacy, one built on honest work, solid foundations, and quiet strength. Allen Heritage Works is stable, respected, and slowly growing. We aren't as flashy as our competitors, but our work is impeccable. We rebuilt our reputation one perfect steel beam at a time. Blake left Raleigh. I heard from our aunt that he moved out west, taking on a low-level sales job for another company. He lost everything. The money, the status, the respect. He had to start over from nothing. Then, about a month ago, he called. I didn't recognize the number. His voice was different when I answered. Quieter, stripped of all its old arrogance. Leach? He asked. Blake, I said. We sat in silence for a long moment, a decade of unspoken things hanging between us. I wanted to say I'm sorry, he finally said, his voice low and strained. For everything. You were right. Dad was right. You deserved more than I ever gave you. I looked out my office window, at the house across the street, at the life I had built for myself. I didn't need more. Blake, I replied, the words coming easily, truthfully. I just needed respect. Yeah, he said, a note of finality in his voice. I get that now. When I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet settling in my soul. I walked over to the mantel in my living room, where an old photo of Dad sits. He's younger in the picture, smiling, standing in front of the then newly built frame of the Allen Steelworks factory. He'd known us both better than we knew ourselves. He understood that my brother's hunger for power would be his undoing, and that my quiet patience was my greatest strength. In the end, Blake got what he wanted, a chance to be the king. And I got what I needed, a chance to prove what I could build, and Dad's final plan worked perfectly.